Today is Christmas, and therefore I thought it would be a good day to show you the family tree of Jesus. In addition to looking at the members of his immediate family, I'll also be talking about his ancestry, based on the genealogies given in Matthew and Luke. Please note that this video is the last in my series on biblical genealogy, so if you haven't yet watched the previous episodes and would like to do so, you can find the links to those in the description. Before I begin, I want to let you know two things. First of all, for this particular video, I feel that it's important to point out that I myself am not a Christian. So please understand that this video is coming strictly from an academic perspective. The second thing I want to let you know is that although I do not believe that Jesus was the Son of God, I do believe that Jesus was a historical person. This is actually the view of most professional historians. Although there are some who argue that Jesus never existed, this is currently a minority position, and one that I myself do not hold. That said, I should point out that there is in fact very little information available about Jesus and his family, outside of the New Testament and other early Christian sources. And even within those sources, the information is often unclear. This has led different branches of Christianity to develop different traditions about the family of Jesus. And this means that there is no one single, quote-unquote, correct family tree. So what I'm going to show you today is kind of an amalgamation of the various traditions. This means that it may or may not be the same as what you personally are used to seeing. So keep that in mind. I'm not saying that my tree is correct. I'm just going to use this one configuration in order to discuss some of the other possible configurations. So let's begin. The one thing that all Christians agree on is that Jesus' parents were named Joseph and Mary. Now, obviously, according to Christians, Joseph was not the biological father of Jesus because, well, the main idea of Christianity is that Jesus was the Son of God, miraculously conceived in the womb of the Virgin Mary. But legally speaking, Jesus would have been considered the son of Joseph. Now, I'll come back to Joseph a little later when we discuss the ancestries given in Matthew and Luke. In addition to his parents, the New Testament also mentions siblings. In Matthew chapter 13, verses 55 and 56, it says, "Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother's name Mary? And aren't his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? Aren't all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all these things?" So first of all, this is where we learn that Joseph was a carpenter. But this is also where we learn that Jesus had both brothers and sisters. Now, the sisters are not named, but the brothers are. And it would appear that there were four of them: James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. And this is where different branches of Christianity start to disagree. According to some Christians, these four individuals were in fact the literal brothers of Jesus, i.e., children born to Mary sometime after the birth of Jesus. Remember, Mary was a virgin when Jesus was born, so these would have to be younger brothers. They would also technically be half-brothers, being that Jesus was the Son of God and they were not. However, there are a few other possibilities. Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox Christians, and some Protestants believe that Mary remained a virgin for the rest of her life. Therefore, these so-called brothers must either be sons of Joseph from a previous marriage, which would make them older brothers, or they were actually Jesus' cousins. The argument for them being cousins is based on the fact that Jews at the time did not have separate words for brother versus cousin. Any male relative of a similar age was simply your brother. Sometimes, like today, even a non-relative with whom you are really close is called your brother. For the sake of this chart, I'm going to go with the cousin theory, and I'm going to assume that they were cousins from Mary's side of the family, not Joseph's. This is because in the gospel accounts, Joseph seems to disappear from the story by the time Jesus reaches adulthood. Yet Jesus remains close to his mother and several other women who seem to have been his maternal aunts. Now, speaking of women that Jesus was close to, let's take a moment to talk about the Marys. And yes, notice that I just said Marys, plural, not Mary, singular. I've already mentioned Mary, the mother of Jesus, but that Mary is not the only Mary mentioned in the New Testament. In fact, there are at least 3 Marys and perhaps as many as 6. So let's take a moment to sort them out. I'm going to start with John chapter 19, verse 25. There we read, "Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene." So from this verse, it's clear that there were at least 3 separate people named Mary. Although the verse doesn't mention it, we know that the mother of Jesus was named Mary. Then we get at least 2 more. Mary, the wife of Clopas, who, according to the grammar of the sentence, seems to be Jesus' aunt, and someone called Mary Magdalene. So 3 Marys. But things get a bit confusing when we look at the same part of the story in the other gospel accounts. Matthew also mentions 3 women at the crucifixion. In his version, in Matthew 27, verses 55 and 56, we read, "Many women were there, watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons." So here there is no mention of Jesus' mother, but we do get Mary Magdalene again, as well as someone who is referred to as Mary, the mother of James and Joseph. According to many scholars, the assumption is that this Mary is the same Mary as Mary, the wife of Clopas. So if this is true, it is confirmation that Jesus did indeed have 2 cousins named James and Joseph. Finally, we get a third person who is simply referred to as the mother of Zebedee's sons. Now, we know from other parts of the New Testament that the sons of Zebedee were James and John, 2 of the original 12 disciples. Okay, now let's look at the Gospel of Mark. In that version of the story, in Mark 15, verse 40, we read, "Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James the Younger and of Joseph, and Salome." So here it seems that we have the same 3 women mentioned by Matthew, but we get a few more pieces of information. First, we learn that James, the cousin of Jesus, had a nickname. He was called the Younger. This was probably to distinguish him from James the son of Zebedee, who is called James the Elder. In later tradition, the terms James the Less and James the Great were used, but keep in mind that these terms do not refer to importance. From Mark, we also learn that the mother of the 2 sons of Zebedee was named Salome, and according to tradition, her full name was actually Mary Salome. So this gives us 4 different Marys in total. Now, there's one more gospel, the Gospel of Luke, but unfortunately, Luke does not name the women at the cross. However, he does include a story not given in the other Gospels about 2 women named Mary and Martha who lived in a town called Bethany. So this is possibly a 5th Mary. However, according to tradition, Mary of Bethany was the same person as Mary Magdalene. So that once again leaves us with 4. Let's now return to the tree. We can now fill in the name of Mary's sister and her husband. I'll also add Mary Salome off to the side, as well as her husband Zebedee and her 2 sons James and John. I'll also add Mary Magdalene and her sister Martha. From other verses in the Gospels, we know that Mary and Martha had a brother named Lazarus, whom Jesus raised from the dead. So I'll add him as well. Okay, let's now focus a bit more on Jesus's cousins. To do this, let's talk about the 12 disciples, later known as the 12 apostles. Simon Peter is always mentioned first, along with his brother Andrew. This is because Peter ended up becoming the leader of the Jesus movement after Jesus' death. In fact, Catholics consider him to have been the first pope. After Peter and Andrew come James and John, the sons of Zebedee. As I've already mentioned, this James became known as James the Great. We then get Philip, Bartholomew, also known as Nathaniel, Thomas, and Matthew. Finally, we get another James, mentioned as being the son of Alphaeus in order to distinguish him from James, the son of Zebedee. Then Thaddeus, who was also called Judas, Simon, nicknamed the Zealot, and last of all, Judas Iscariot. He comes last because he's the one who famously betrayed Jesus. He's the only one of the 12 who didn't become an apostle. He was later replaced by a man named Matthias. Now, here's the interesting thing. The last 3 names before Judas Iscariot match 3 of the names of Jesus' cousins. And according to some scholars, the name Alphaeus is an alternative version of the name Clopas. So, according to several branches of Christianity, these 3 disciples were in fact the cousins of Jesus. What happened to Joseph, the 4th cousin, we do not know. But the fact that these 3 are always listed last in the lists of the disciples, other than Judas Iscariot, of course, I think is further evidence that they were in fact the cousins of Jesus. It's likely that the early Christians were being careful not to give them any special treatment. So let me tell you a bit more about them. Not only was James the Less one of the 12 apostles, he was also one of the main leaders of the early church. In fact, some branches of Christianity call him the first bishop of Jerusalem. He is also thought to have written one of the books in the New Testament, the one called James. Simon is notable in that he is thought to have taken over the leadership of the Jerusalem church after the death of James, and is thus considered by some to have been the second bishop there. Finally, Judas is traditionally thought to be the author of the New Testament book of Jude. While we're at it, let's talk about the sons of Zebedee as well. According to legend, James the Great traveled to Spain and then reappeared there centuries later to help fight against the Muslim invaders. For these reasons, he is considered to be the patron saint of Spain. His brother John, however, is perhaps more well known. He is thought by many to be the author of the Gospel of John, who is also known as the disciple whom Jesus loved, as well as the author of 3 letters named 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and the book of Revelation. Now remember, I'm just presenting one view among many, and one that is based entirely on tradition, not on historical evidence. There are other scholars who, for example, would say that John of Patmos, who wrote Revelation, was probably a totally different John than this John. And others who think that there were possibly 3 or 4 different people named James, not just 2. So let me say it again. There is no one quote-unquote correct way to look at all of this. All right, we're not done yet. According to many branches of Christianity, we actually know the names of Mary's father and mother as well, who would also be the parents of Mary of Clopas and the grandparents of not only Jesus, but of at least 3 of the 12 apostles. According to tradition, they are named Joachim and Anne. In the Quran, Joachim is called Imran, and although Anne is not named, the Semitic version of her name would be Hannah. Now, in the Middle Ages, a tradition developed that considered Mary Salome to be the daughter of Anne as well. In some versions, the three Marys had three different fathers, but in other versions, they were all the daughters of Joachim and Anne. I'm going to leave a question mark here because to me, it seems that the earliest traditions considered these four to be the cousins of Jesus, but not these two. Okay, we can actually go one step further in this family tree. According to tradition, Anne was the daughter of a priest named Mathan and the sister of a woman named Sobe, who in turn was the mother of Elizabeth. Anne and Sobe do not appear in the New Testament, but Elizabeth and her husband Zechariah do. According to the Gospel of Luke, Elizabeth was a close relative of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and the two women were pregnant at the same time. Mary, of course, had Jesus, and Elizabeth had John the Baptist. And this John was definitely a different John from the John who wrote the Gospel of John. According to Christianity, John the Baptist was sort of a forerunner for Jesus and prepared the way for him. But according to the New Testament, he was killed by Herod Antipas prior to the death of Jesus. As the story goes, his head was delivered to Antipas on a plate at the bequest of his wife and niece, Herodias. At this point, let's return to Joseph, the father of Jesus. The problem here is that the New Testament gives us two conflicting genealogies for Joseph. In Matthew, Joseph is said to be the son of Jacob, who in turn was the son of Mathan. However, in Luke, Joseph is said to be the son of Heli, the son of Mathat. Now, interestingly, in both cases, the name of Joseph's grandfather is similar. It also happens to be the same name that is traditionally given to Mary's grandfather. So, one possibility is that Joseph and Mary were cousins, a practice that was certainly not unheard of at the time. But let's look at the genealogies in Matthew and Luke in more detail. On this chart, I have three columns. The left column is the genealogy given in the Gospel of Matthew, which traces a direct line from Abraham to Jesus. The middle column is the genealogy given in the Gospel of Luke, which traces a direct line all the way from Adam to Jesus. Finally, the right column is a genealogy based on the Hebrew Bible, known to Christians as the Old Testament. Obviously, this one doesn't include Jesus, but it does cover everything from Adam to a man named Zerubbabel. So let's start at the top. From Adam to Abraham, we can only compare Luke and the Hebrew Bible. And what we find is that the genealogy is exactly the same, with one exception. Curiously, Luke includes an extra generation. A man named Canaan is placed between Arphaxad and Shelah. Once we get to Abraham, we can compare all three genealogies. And up until King David, all three are exactly the same. Except, once again, Luke adds an extra generation. In place of Ram, we get two names, Arni and Admin. But when we get to King David, this is where the accounts in Matthew and Luke start to diverge. Matthew continues with Solomon, and his list pretty much matches up with the royal line of Judah as described in the Hebrew Bible. The only difference is that he leaves out four names, Ahaziah, Joash, Amaziah, and Jehoiakim. One possible reason for this is that these four kings were said to have been particularly evil. In contrast, Luke continues his list with an obscure son of David known as Nathan. He then goes on to list a bunch of names that do not match with any known genealogy in the Bible or anywhere else. But then, curiously, something strange occurs. Two names on his list suddenly match up with two of the names found on both Matthew's list and the list from the Hebrew Bible, Shealtiel and Zerubbabel. Now, it's possible that this could be just a coincidence and that Luke's Shealtiel and Zerubbabel are totally different people. But because of their placement in time on the lists and the importance of these two individuals in Jewish history, it does seem that Luke is referring to the same two people. But from this point, Matthew and Luke diverge again. And now, neither list can be compared to the Hebrew Bible, because the main story in the Hebrew Bible ends around the time of Zerubbabel. The obvious difference between the last set of names on Matthew's list and the last set of names on Luke's list is that Luke's includes about twice as many names. So the assumption is that Matthew must have left out some generations here and there. After all, we already know that he did this earlier. The adding and skipping of generations is probably related to the fact that both Matthew and Luke were aiming to come up with particular sets of numbers. In Matthew, the entire genealogy can be divided into 3 sets of 14. 14 being 2 times 7, and we know that 7 was and is a particularly important number for Jews. In Luke, the entire genealogy adds up to exactly 77 names. Again, the whole thing is centered on the number 7. But the big question is, how can there be 2 different sets of names between Zerubbabel and Joseph? Well, the most common explanation is that one of these lists is actually showing Jesus' maternal line. In other words, the line of Mary, even though they both say Joseph. Most Christian scholars say that Matthew covers Joseph's line and Luke covers Mary's line, although I have seen some scholars who argue for the reverse. There are even some attempts out there to reconcile the 2 lists by adding in things like second marriages and stepchildren. But to me, I don't think that's necessary. Personally, I think there is a simpler solution. But please note that at this point, I am strictly stating my own opinion. I think the reason why the 2 genealogies don't match is that neither of them are genuine. In other words, I think that both Matthew and Luke made up the final parts of their genealogies basically from scratch. Now, as I said at the beginning of this video, I am not a Christian. But even if I were, I don't think the fact that they made up genealogies would necessarily be a problem. It's clear that both genealogies have several poetic, symbolic elements. For example, I've already talked about the numerology, but there's more. There's some very slight spelling changes in Matthew's account. For example, he changes Asa to Asaph and Amon to Amos. Asaph was a writer of Psalms, and Amos was one of the prophets. So this would appear to be a nod to the prophets and the writings, the 2 sections of the Hebrew Bible that, together with the Torah, make up the Tanakh. He also specifically mentions 4 women, all 4 of whom were probably non-Israelites. So that's a little nod to the Gentiles. As I said at the very beginning of this series, the purpose of the Bible is to make theological points, not to record literal history. And I think this goes for certain sections of the Gospels as well. Yes, the Gospel writers certainly believed that Jesus was the Son of God. And yes, they certainly believed that as the Jewish Messiah, he was the literal descendant of King David. But I don't think that the exact specifics matter to them as much as they matter to us in our very detailed-oriented modern minds today. Again, this is just my opinion. But please understand that the Bible can be understood in different ways. And just because someone understands it differently than you, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are non-religious. Okay, so that wraps up the family tree of Jesus, as well as the complete series that I've been doing on biblical genealogy. If you're interested in viewing the other episodes or in buying my biblical family tree poster, you can find the links to everything in the description. Happy holidays, and thanks for watching.